process that's well controlled, well characterized, and well validated. Otherwise, where do we land? So that interplay ends up being super important. And what does that look like? So for us, I think it's worth talking about what the titanium implant process looks like. Again, this is where most, if we're talking about metal printing, titanium has been a strong leader. There's some work in implantable 316. There's a number of devices out there in cobalt chrome, but the vast majority are in titanium, grade 23 titanium or potentially grade 5 titanium, but typically, and occasionally some CP1 commercially pure titanium. But what does that process look like for laser e-beam powder bed fusion? First we have to look at the feedstock. What's the deposition quality look like? The chemistry and the morphology. How does it flow? Ultimately, it's important for a powder bed process that we have good flowability and good homogeneous interplay over the entire build platform. And then we need to manage the powder recycling and sieving. Then you need to look at the process itself. How are those controlled? What are your various input variables? And how do they affect the output? And then ultimately on the product side, what does the product requirement needs to have? I mean, you're looking at a phase change process, right? You start with powder, you melt it into a solid metal. You're almost as a foundry and a surface treatment all in one. And it really needs to be thought in that way. So, it's not a forging or a casting, and it's not a porous plasma spray. It's a combination of both in a lot of degrees, and that's how the process needs to be thought of. So as we look at the qualification and validation approach, what we've really defined and have been talking about within the industry, and this goes into ASTM, ASME, ISO, and others where we've written guidelines. There's a number of work items out there where these guidelines are in play, but the overall process begins with a strong quality management system and a strong risk management system, typically following ISO 14971, beginning with process validation, where you can follow a characterization approach. I'm going to talk a little bit more about a characterization that we've done internally and share some of that data. Again, it's on the laser powder bed system, but it's really interesting to see what happens. But following that characterization, full factorial DOE in this case, following into an OQPQ, we've already done the IQ. So installation qualification is done. Operational qualification challenges based on your worst case parameters of a DOE and a PQ through assesses nominal through a series of shutdowns and startups. That then moves into qualified equipment. You don't want to tie your process validation to your product validation, nor do you want to tie every new piece of equipment to a new process validation. This is a place where the industry has matured a lot. Equipment's better, software is better. There's a lot more reliability here. So each piece of equipment, then it's essentially a machine matching study. So an IQ and then a PQ. And then from a product validation standpoint, at this point, the user would understand what the worst case is and then work towards that worst case product development. So this is typically where you look at the cleaning validation in powder systems. Obviously getting the powder out of there is always the trick. There's not great guidance from a regulatory standpoint on what this looks like, but then also the fit, form, and function of the device. So breaking it, making sure that in fatigue properties are what we need it to be. Different indications are going to require testing. What have we done here? So I like to talk a little bit about what we've done. So we have a full factorial DOE, 16 runs, 4 variables, assessed against the various standards within the industry. And we'll talk a little bit about the results here. And I'd encourage, anybody that's getting into real deal implants, even on our system, from a 3D system standpoint, I think this is a nice way to go about it. And I'd encourage anybody to do something similar and reach out with any questions. But essentially what we did here is assess our critical process parameters against our critical to quality outputs. And did a full factorial design of experiments to understand what those inputs mean from an analysis of variance standpoint. what ended up happening is that we then did an analysis via ANOVA of the various effects. So some of those constantly held parameters, such as build location, layer thickness, and otherwise. What we did here was do an ANOVA analysis and ended up splitting the population in that way. Where we ended up landing with it is that the titanium process is incredibly capable. That's why it's a natural use within the medical device community. Basically, the process is super robust within the normal amount of variability within that. So where we came to with it, we did a PPK analysis, and all factors from a mechanical standpoint were well above the Six Sigma level. So from an industry standpoint, this is sort of the acceptable level would be 1.33 or a Six Sigma level. And these all exceed that. So when we start thinking about the way that innovation can happen, having the reliability of the process like this really helps drive that innovation. You can't have one without the other. Chemistry, similar level of capability. There's some spiciness with aluminum and oxygen. This is due to some factors within the process. Aluminum, because of some high energy processes like DED and E-beam, you're typically starting your build material with a high aluminum content. You get a lower capability, but you're not picking up aluminum in the process. And then oxygen's kind of the key with titanium, and it's always going to be on the higher end to meet those properties, but it's going to maintain that powder reuse throughout a long life cycle when in an inert environment, the way that we operate at least. So what was really interesting about this study is that we could not actually reach the end of the powder life cycle. We think it's 126 reuses, but we ran out at 72 by volume, and that was a 1 ton batch of powder. So this is a really quick snapshot of what's done from a process reliability standpoint. So what does this mean from a use case? So again, the ability to create functional designs that meet, say the modulus of Kinsella's bone, and have basically an infinite amount of lattice structures. This allows, and the ability to meet high reliability standards within the ASTM community. This allows us to create medical devices that clinically perform better, are from a supply chain standpoint can be created much faster, and then decrease the development time because we're able to iterate really quickly. Another workflow that we work on a lot is the patient matched workflow. So, working from DICOM images through to design, manufacture, and then ultimately surgery. We still, most of these are instruments, and there's a regulatory pathway here that's a bit trickier, but I think this is what the future holds. So as we think about what's next, I think, we've seen the industry move towards personalized instruments or personalized guidance to match an off-the-shelf implant. And a lot of these off-the-shelf implants are printed in metal. Even some of those instruments are printed in metal as well. But what the future will hold is to move more towards personalized implants as well. There's a big regulatory process that's going to need to be handled there. But with the process reliability and the in situ monitoring and the ability to do this that we just described, that pathway becomes a lot more clear. Then we start thinking about closed loop processes. When you're building within an envelope rather than building the exact same size, what does that validation and verification look like? Closed loop processes, both from the simulation side through to in-process changes within a validated process window, will allow us to build personalized implants with better reliability. Build parameters will still need to be qualified within a geometric range and within that process window, but this will allow for higher yields, better safety and reliability of those implants. But there's a technological pathway that needs to continue to develop here. With all this needs to be a clear regulatory pathway as well. FDA has done a nice job of coming out with some guidance for additively manufactured devices. There's a call out there for feedback on the point of care guidance that just came out. So I'd encourage this community to go through, read that, understand it, and provide guidance. That's another place where this is going. And we as an industry need to help our regulators deeply understand process and deliver the data and characterization to show that what we are producing can be safe and effective, or substantially equivalent to devices that are subtractively or conventionally manufactured. And that's a big pathway to overcome. So I think that's 15 minutes on the dot. I know I tried to run through a lot of information rather quickly. Some of this is available on the interweb. So if there's a white paper that goes into a lot more detail about the process characterization that we just talked about. I promise it's not too salesy and it's very technical. So I'd encourage anybody to read that. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that very in-depth discussion. It's definitely both informative and also in-depth enough. I like the technical aspects, something that I need to learn more about. So one quick question actually about 3D system, and I'm going to go into the audience questions. How do you guys work with everybody else in terms of these metal process? You got your process down, you have the machine. How do you work with the hospitals? Do you work with companies? How do you work with them?
It's really a little bit of both. So, I mean, 3D Systems, we see ourselves as a solution company, a solution provider, and specifically that's what my group does. So it's the right solution at the right time. I'd say primarily we're business to business. We work with medical device OEMs to deliver those solutions within the medical device space. They'll generally have the infrastructure and foundational things to distribute, market, and sell said devices. But we are also seeing a lot more growth in the point of care aspect of what we do. And especially as you start thinking about some of the more of the polymer base, when you start thinking about metal, it gets a little trickier because the infrastructure needed to print metal, and especially titanium, which is a reactive explosive material, that gets a little spicy when you start thinking about co-locating that at hospitals.
Yep.
So I guess in short, we work with it all. The point of care growth is significant, especially on the polymer side. On the metal side, where I'd anticipate it going is centers of excellence to serve, geographical hospital groups. So, there's some public work that we've done with the VA, and that's really exciting. So actually porting some of the stuff that we do here in Colorado, porting that to the VA and really enabling them to do it themselves. Next steps there are, centers of excellence within the VA to be able to do more of that and offer a broader range of clinical services to better serve their patients. Some of the big hospitals like, Hospital for Special Surgery, Mayo, these guys have big 3D printing centers already as well.
Yep. And I think actually, many years ago when I was in Children's Hospital Boston, they already have a metal printer.
Yep.
So I definitely can foresee that happening. That's going to be very exciting. But I think that's going to be related to our next question from the audience. One is, how are you going to? I don't think you're going to be the person who's convincing the surgeons, but how? First of all, is there a performance advantage for sure that's absolutely validated? That's better. For example, vertebral body cage is performing better 3D printed.
Yeah, I think, there's, and how you convince a surgeon is you show them data, right? And this is working with the OEM to show that data. I don't think a surgeon's too interested in the tensile data or the powder use data that I just showed. The end use surgeon, the key opinion leaders and the design team is going to be interested in that because they need to have that reliability. What becomes really interesting is the biocompatibility aspects. So the specific aspects of a porous structure and how those clinically perform and can clinically perform better than, say, a titanium coated PEEK interbody. And then the way that the way that the device is designed from a lattice perspective to decrease subsidence, just to say something for an interbody, because it more closely mimics the modulus of cancellous bone. And doesn't subside, that you reduce subsidence when implanted. And there's a lot out there. So typically we'll work with the OEM in their clinical group and their key opinion leaders to understand what their needs are in that space, and then support them through that entire process. You have some that if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, throw it in. And then you have some that are going to go to the bottom of the ocean and do longitudinal studies, animal studies, and whatnot to show the clinical outcomes are improved.
Yeah.
And we support that whole way through.
Cool. I got a couple of friends here who are asking questions. I know they're experts in metal. One is from Zolt Pastor. He's actually expert in metal as well. He says, how much is porosity of the printed parts? Do you make hip? I think these are very specific.
We're printing at 99.95% dense material. We still hip, but I think you can make the argument that you don't need to. That's changed drastically in the last 10 years. When I did my first implant, I did it using an electron beam technology back in 2010. Those you had to hip as well. But in laser powder bed, which I'm by far more familiar with, and some of the other folks here are talking about different technologies, so they'll have to speak to that. But we're printing 99.95% dense and up material. You can make the very solid argument that you can get by with an anneal, but because we've been doing hip for so long, it's hard to put that toothpaste back in the tube. So I'd say the bulk of parts are still hipped in general.
That's a really interesting question because a few weeks ago, we kind of reshared this design graphic that went viral. It was actually a very porous hip implant, just design concept, and everybody was, not happy with it. And I didn't understand why that was the case. And now I kind of know why.
You want pores where you want them, and this is the nice thing about additive. You can design porosity in, and you can do some very, very interesting things from a design and performance standpoint there. But if you want material to be dense and perform similar to forging, say, then you need it to be dense, especially in titanium, where if you have pores within the device, that can act as a stress concentrator and then initiate a fatigue failure of the device. And most of these devices are loaded in some sort of a fatigue environment, whether compression or otherwise.
Great. Okay, the final question, and then the rest of the question I'm going to address at the end of the webinar, or you can type in the answer. From Fabio Santana, I think he's from.
Hey, Fabio.
He knows everybody. If you see different paths for the shelf and custom implants.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely it's a different pathway. I think ultimately it'll become more clear. I mean, there's a number of 510(k) approvals for what would be call it mass customized pathway, but where it's an off the shelf custom device. So I mean, you have some interesting work already in the subtractive industry, both in like the CMF reconstructive space, and like hit revision, like triflanges and hemipelvis, where you can already go that route. So I think it will start to converge. Right now, they're very, very different.
Awesome. So we're having very heated discussion here. I love this, guys. Put your question in, but now we're going to have to move on to our next